At dawn, Frost clung to pine needles as a county survey crew noticed something wrong beside an unused farm road. A shape interrupted the mud, still out of season. Radios crackled, notebooks opened, and the air felt narrower while evidence waited, unspoken, demanding order before procedure finally began quietly there. If you like stories like this, make sure to subscribe and like the video. The location lay outside Orangeburg, South Carolina, where two-lane roads cut through fields and winter mornings arrived gray and sharp. The woman was identified later that day as Emily Carter, 22 years old, last known address a rented duplex near the town square. Her name joined the ledger with a date stamped December 3, 1995, and a case number that would cool in filing cabinets for decades. Early assessments focused on surroundings rather than spectacle. Tire impressions were photographed, soil samples bagged, and distances measured from fence posts and culverts. The absence of obvious disturbance suggested placement rather than chance, and that inference guided the first hours. Emily Carter had been reported missing the previous evening, when Thanksgiving leftovers still crowded refrigerators and Christmas lights blinked uncertainly along Main Street. She worked evenings at a local pharmacy and attended a nearby community college, balancing coursework with shifts that ended after dark. Coworkers recalled her locking the front door on time, turning the sign and walking toward her car under a cold drizzle. That routine, repeated all autumn, framed the initial timeline. Patrol logs confirmed a welfare check requested by her mother after missed calls. Missing person flyers were printed before sunrise, taped to diner windows and courthouse corkboards, their black and white photo catching eyes that would later say they remembered her smile. The autopsy, conducted the following morning, remained clinical and restrained. The pathologist recorded time-of-death indicators consistent with exposure during a cold night, with no public speculation beyond what measurements supported. Fibers were recovered from clothing, cataloged and sealed. Fingernail scrapings were taken, preserved for a future that investigators hoped would arrive sooner. No drugs or alcohol altered the findings. The cause of death, as listed in the report, was sufficient for charging decisions but withheld from public detail to protect integrity. That restraint shaped media coverage, which stayed factual, cautious, and local. December advanced. Churches prepared nativity scenes while detectives canvassed roads leading out of town, noting traffic patterns and holiday travel. A red pickup scene idling near the pharmacy was logged, its owner interviewed and cleared through corroborated alibis. Phone records showed Emily's last call at 9:12 p.m., brief and unremarkable. Credit card activity ended earlier that afternoon. Bank footage yielded no useful angles. Each negative result narrowed possibilities without offering relief. Investigators returned to the farm road, mapping approach routes and testing theories about why that spot had been chosen. It was secluded yet accessible, familiar to anyone who worked the area. The community responded in a manner common to small southern towns facing winter tragedy. Candlelight vigils formed near the gazebo. The local paper ran editorials urging patience and trust in procedure. Tips flowed in, many earnest, some conflicting. Detectives logged them all, assigning follow-ups with methodical calm. One tip mentioned a former boyfriend who had left town after a loud argument weeks earlier. Records showed he was in Charleston that night, employment verified, tolls logged. Another pointed to a drifter seen near a truck stop. Fingerprints did not match, and the lead closed quietly. Christmas arrived with unresolved grief. Officers rotated holiday shifts, files spread across desks under tinsel and calendars. The case cooled in the way cases do, not from neglect but from exhaustion of avenues. Evidence remained preserved, catalog numbers inked carefully. The sheriff addressed the town before New Year. promising persistence. For Emily's family, the season passed with empty chairs and a tree left undecorated. Years followed. Technology changed. The case moved rooms, then buildings, but never disappeared. In 2004, cold case funding allowed re-examination. Fibers were retested against expanded databases, yielding no immediate match. Soil analysis refined the likely placement window but did not name a person. Witness statements were reviewed with fresh eyes, timelines reconstructed against newly digitized records. One detail persisted: a service receipt from a nearby auto shop found near the road, overlooked at first as litter. It was logged and stored. By 2016, advances in DNA analysis reopened possibilities. The fingernail scrapings, preserved since 1995, produced a partial profile. It was insufficient for a direct hit, but strong enough for familial searching once legal thresholds were met. Court approvals were obtained, careful and compliant. Analysts uploaded the profile to a public genealogy database used with consent protocols. Months passed. A distant match appeared, then another, triangulating toward a family long rooted in the county. Investigators traced records, census data, and obituaries, building a family tree that intersected with the auto shop receipt. A mechanic named Thomas Green, then 31 in 1995, had worked late shifts near the pharmacy and owned property bordering the farm road. He had no criminal record at the time and had attended church with Emily's family on holidays. Subtlety governed the approach. Detectives requested a voluntary interview in 2019, framed as routine follow-up. Green complied, calm, cooperative, offering recollections that aligned imperfectly with logs. A discarded coffee cup provided a lawful DNA sample. The lab result closed the distance science had opened. The profile matched the 1995 evidence within accepted statistical certainty. Investigators corroborated with secondary evidence: vehicle ownership consistent with impressions, work schedules placing him nearby, and a witness who recalled his truck that rainy night but had doubted memory for years. An arrest warrant was issued in December, days before Christmas, served without spectacle. The town reacted with the quiet shock reserved for familiarity shattered. Court proceedings unfolded steadily. Defense motions were heard and denied based on chain of custody and methodological rigor. The jury listened to timelines, laboratory explanations, and the careful language of experts. In the end, Thomas Green was convicted and sentenced according to statute. Emily Carter's case closed with a final entry and a date. Afterward, the farm road returned to frost and silence. The courthouse files were archived. The town placed a bench near the gazebo with no inscription beyond a name. Winter continued, and with it, a measure of order restored. The winter following the discovery settled into routine without resolution, and routine has a way of dulling public attention while sharpening internal records. Detectives continued to refine Emily Carter's last movements, building a minute-by-minute outline anchored to receipts, clock-ins, and weather logs. The pharmacy's alarm report confirmed a 9:06 p.m. closure. A streetlight maintenance ticket noted a brief outage on the adjacent block at 9:14 p.m., restored by 9:19 p.m., a detail that suggested darkness at precisely the wrong time. Rain totals from the regional airport matched the dampness found at the site, reinforcing estimates already logged. January brought new leads that dissolved under verification. A transient arrested for theft claimed knowledge of the road, but his fingerprints failed comparison, and his story shifted between interviews. Detectives documented the inconsistencies and closed the line. The case file grew heavier, thicker with reports that read calm but relentless. Each page carried the same header and the same unanswered question. For officers approaching retirement, the case became a marker of unfinished duty, revisited at the end of shifts when the building was quiet and the lights dimmed. Media coverage stabilized into anniversaries. Each December, the local paper printed a brief remembrance, never sensational, noting Emily's age and the open investigation. Her family participated sparingly, offering photographs and a few measured statements that avoided speculation. Their restraint influenced the tone of public discourse, which remained respectful and subdued. In a town where church calendars governed social life, silence itself became a form of acknowledgement. Procedurally, the investigation did not stop. It slowed, then shifted. Evidence storage audits in the early 2000s confirmed seals intact and logs accurate. When digital record-keeping expanded, the case was scanned, indexed, and cross-referenced. Old witness statements were transcribed from tape to text, allowing pattern recognition tools to flag overlaps that human readers might miss. None produced immediate results, but the process preserved continuity. The autopsy report, reviewed again in 2004, benefited from updated interpretive standards. The conclusions remained unchanged, but annotations clarified margins and reinforced timelines. Fibers recovered years earlier were compared against expanded manufacturing databases, excluding several regional sources. That exclusion mattered. It suggested the fibers originated from a limited production run associated with workwear sold locally during the early 1990s. Investigators noted the finding and set it aside, waiting for a name. Community memory proved imperfect but persistent. A retired schoolteacher recalled seeing Emily's car earlier that evening, parked closer to the pharmacy than usual. A clerk at a gas station remembered a pickup pulling out abruptly as rain intensified. Each recollection was logged with caveats, weighed against objective data. None alone met thresholds, but together they described movement and proximity consistent with opportunity. By the time cold case funding expanded statewide, Orangeburg's files were ready. A dedicated review team approached the case without sentiment, mapping evidence to modern standards. They began with the fingernail scrapings, preserved carefully since 1995. Advances in amplification yielded a partial genetic profile, incomplete but stable. Legal counsel reviewed options, ensuring compliance with evolving privacy law. Approval came slowly, deliberately, reflecting caution rather than reluctance. Parallel work focused on geography. The farm road's ownership history revealed parcels leased intermittently to service companies and individuals tied to local trades. Utility maps showed access points that would have been known to those working nearby after hours. This analysis narrowed the field without naming suspects, a necessary step that avoided premature conclusions. The genealogy search, once authorized, unfolded methodically. Analysts uploaded the profile to a database with opt-in participants. Weeks passed without movement. Then a distant relative appeared, sharing a small percentage of markers. Another match followed, closer, narrowing the tree. Public records filled gaps between names, births, and deaths, drawing lines across decades. The process was technical, unemotional, and precise. Investigators noticed convergence around a family long present in the county, associated with automotive work and rural properties. They reviewed employment records from 1995, cross-checking schedules with the outage window and the gas station recollection. One name aligned with multiple points without forcing interpretation. Still, alignment was not proof. The team proceeded with restraint. Surveillance remained limited and lawful. A voluntary interview request was drafted with care, emphasizing routine review. The subject cooperated, offering recollections that seemed plausible until measured against logs. Differences were minor but consistent. Consent procedures were followed. A discarded item provided a comparative sample, collected without spectacle and logged meticulously. Laboratory confirmation arrived months later, its language precise and cautious. The match probability exceeded accepted standards. Investigators corroborated with secondary evidence, ensuring the case would rest on more than a single pillar. Vehicle records matched impressions. Property access matched placement. Witness memories, once fragile, found context. The arrest, when it came, followed policy. It occurred in December, a timing dictated by readiness rather than symbolism. The community learned through the evening news, reactions muted by age and familiarity. For many, the shock lay not in violence but in proximity. Pretrial proceedings advanced through winter. Motions addressed chain of custody and methodology, resolved through documentation preserved for years. Expert testimony clarified processes without embellishment. The jury received a narrative built on records rather than rhetoric. Deliberation ended with a verdict that closed the procedural arc. Sentencing followed statute. Appeals were noted and resolved. The courthouse returned to routine. Files moved to archives, labeled complete. For Emily Carter's family, closure arrived quietly, without ceremony, marked by a headstone visit during a cold morning when lights appeared again along Main Street. The years between discovery and arrest carried a particular weight for those who kept the file alive. For men who had worked cases since the 70s and 80s, the passage of time was measured not in promotions but in paper aging and ink fatting. Emily Carter's folder bore that patina. Its pages smelled faintly of storage, yet the contents remained sharp, each entry a deliberate note written to survive scrutiny. That discipline mattered when renewed attention arrived, because cold cases reward precision and punish haste. When the review team revisited the earliest interviews, they did so with the understanding that memory degrades unevenly. Statements taken within hours of the disappearance were prioritized, their phrasing preserved. Officers compared them against weather records, verifying whether rain intensified before or after the pharmacy closed. Meteorological logs showed a band moving through just after 9, consistent with damp impressions and muted sound. This alignment reinforced the window without adding drama. It was the kind of confirmation investigators trusted. Emily's personal life was examined without intrusion. Bank records showed modest balances, steady patterns, no anomalies. Class schedules placed her on campus during daylight hours, instructors confirming attendance. She had plans for Christmas break, documented in notes to her mother about a short trip after finals. Those plans ended abruptly, and that absence informed the investigation more than speculation ever could. Attention returned repeatedly to geography. The farm road was not random. It connected to service routes used by utilities and trades, avoided by through traffic but known locally. Mapping exercises layered access points, lighting conditions, and sightlines. At night with rain, the area offered concealment without isolation, a balance often exploited by offenders familiar with routine movement. This assessment did not accuse, it described opportunity. The receipt found near the road became a focal artifact during later reviews. Initially logged as debris, it gained significance when cross-referenced with shop hours and staffing. The timestamp fell within the outage window. The paper stock matched a regional supplier serving a limited number of businesses. Investigators traced distribution lists, narrowing origins. This work was slow, administrative, and essential. Community interviews were revisited with consent, acknowledging the burden of repetition. Some witnesses declined, a choice respected. Others offered clarifications shaped by time. A woman recalled headlights moving without stopping. A farmer mentioned a gate usually closed that night left ajar the next morning. Each detail was weighed, never elevated beyond its capacity to support or refute. The forensic review extended beyond genetics. Soil comparisons between the site and adjacent properties revealed similar mineral profiles, expected given proximity, but vehicle transfer patterns suggested recent travel. The analysis did not overstate conclusions. It provided context that, when combined with other elements, supported coherence. Legal standards guided every step. The decision to pursue familial searching followed consultation with prosecutors and independent advisors. Warrants were precise, language careful. Investigators documented alternatives considered and rejected. This transparency would later withstand challenge. As the genealogy results matured, analysts resisted confirmation bias. They sought disconfirming evidence with equal vigor. When a branch suggested a plausible suspect, parallel branches were explored until exhausted. Only when convergence persisted did the team advance. This restraint reflected experience earned over decades. The voluntary interview conducted years later unfolded without pressure. Notes captured tone and content, not impressions. When recollections diverged from records, the discrepancies were catalogued neutrally. Consent procedures were followed meticulously, reflecting awareness that procedure is substance in court. Laboratory work proceeded independently. Analysts were blinded to narrative details, receiving only identifiers necessary for comparison. The resulting report spoke in probabilities, not absolutes. That language guided next steps without inflaming them. Corroboration extended to vehicle maintenance logs and property records. Tires replaced months after the crime were noted without inference. Work orders placed the subject near the pharmacy that evening, a fact aligned with shop schedules. Witness recollections of a pickup gained clarity when matched to documented ownership. The arrest, executed lawfully, did not resolve the case by itself. Resolution required adjudication. Pretrial hearings tested the file's integrity. Chain of custody logs preserved across administrations proved their worth. Defense challenges prompted detailed explanations that reaffirmed process. During trial, the presentation remained factual. Exhibits displayed timelines rather than narratives. Experts explained methods accessible to lay understanding without simplification. The jury's task was to assess alignment, not to be persuaded by flourish. The verdict closed a chapter that had spanned seasons. Sentencing followed guidelines, acknowledging gravity without excess. Appeals were noted and addressed through established channels. Each step added a date, a stamp, and a sense of finality grounded in law. After the proceedings, attention turned to aftermath. The sheriff's office reviewed policies, noting lessons in evidence preservation and periodic review. Training incorporated the case as an example of patience rewarded. The town absorbed the outcome with subdued acceptance, mindful of proximity and time. For Emily Carter's family, closure arrived in increments. A letter from the prosecutor outlined the findings in plain language. The case file, once heavy with uncertainty, now rested complete. Winter returned, lights appeared again, and the bench near the gazebo remained, a quiet marker in a place that had learned to wait. Time, once an adversary, became an instrument of clarity as the case moved from verdict to record. Administrative closure required more than a signed judgment. It demanded reconciliation of every exhibit, confirmation that appeals windows were honored, and notation of final disposition in systems that spanned paper and digital eras. Clerks completed checklists with a diligence shaped by winter routines, their breath visible in unheated corridors during early mornings. The courthouse had always been a place of process rather than display, and in this matter, It remained faithful to that character. Investigators compiled a comprehensive after-action review, not for publicity but for institutional memory. It traced decisions from the first hour through decades, identifying junctures where patients preserved options. The report emphasized preservation practices that allowed modern analysis to speak to old evidence. It also acknowledged limits, noting leads that consumed time without return. Such honesty served future cases better than triumphal summaries. Emily Carter's timeline was finalized with a clarity unavailable in 1995. The last confirmed sighting, the outage window, the rain band, and the placement interval aligned without strain. The sequence did not require embellishment. It stood on documentation, logs, receipts, and laboratory reports. The absence of spectacle became a strength, reinforcing trust in the outcome. Media coverage at closure remained local and measured. The paper printed a single column describing the sentence and reminding readers of the long arc of the investigation. No photographs of grief were published. The tone matched the town's sensibility, reflecting respect earned over years of restraint. Letters to the editor thanked the investigators and urged continued funding for cold casework, framing the outcome as civic rather than dramatic. For officers who had retired, the resolution arrived through phone calls and brief visits. Some returned to the station to review the final report, nodding at familiar handwriting and margins. The case had accompanied their careers, and its closure felt like setting down a weight carried without complaint. There were no speeches, only acknowledgments exchanged quietly in hallways. Training programs incorporated the case into curricula. Recruits studied evidence handling, learning why seals matter and why notes must be written as if read decades later. Instructors emphasized lawful innovation, explaining how emerging tools require careful authorization. The lesson was not about luck, but about readiness to act when readiness becomes possible. The farm road remained unchanged. County maintenance graded it once a year, smoothing ruts left by trucks. Frost returned each December, and pine needles fell as they always had. There was no marker at the site by design. The place had served its unwanted role and was allowed to recede into anonymity. Memory shifted elsewhere. At the gazebo near the square, the bench bearing Emily Carter's name received occasional visitors. Some sat briefly, reading the inscription, then moved on. Others left small arrangements during holidays. The bench was not a memorial in the traditional sense, but a pause within daily life, consistent with the town's preference for understatement. Legal closure brought administrative calm. Restitution orders were addressed, victim services concluded their formal role, and correspondence slowed. The appeals process resolved without reversal, confirming the durability of the file. The final docket entry recorded compliance and completion, a simple line that carried years of work. The broader impact extended beyond one case. Cold case units statewide cited the investigation when advocating for resources, demonstrating that careful stewardship yields results even after long intervals. Legislators referenced the outcome during budget hearings, emphasizing public confidence grounded in lawful procedure. The case became an example without becoming a spectacle. Seasonal rhythms continued. Thanksgiving dinners gathered families who remembered when Emily had been a student with plans. Christmas lights returned to Main Street, blinking steadily against dark windows. New Year's arrived without sirens or announcements. Time moved forward as it does, absorbing events into routine while leaving traces in records and recollections. For Emily Carter's mother, closure was not an ending but a boundary. She received the final notification letter and placed it with earlier correspondence, completing a folder begun in 1995. Visits to the courthouse ceased. The bench by the gazebo became the place of remembrance, visited during quiet mornings when the town was still. The sheriff's office archived the case file according to retention schedules, ensuring accessibility for future reference. Digital backups were verified, metadata checked. The physical file was boxed and labeled, its weight unchanged but its purpose fulfilled. In storage, it joined others resolved and unresolved, each a testament to method. As years passed, new cases arrived, each demanding attention. The lessons learned persisted in habits, careful logging, respectful communication, and adherence to law. Officers spoke less about the shock of arrest and more about the patience required to reach it. That emphasis shaped culture. Winter returned again. Frost appeared on pine needles along roads leading out of town. The courthouse opened on time. Radios crackled with routine calls. Somewhere in the archives, a completed file rested, its dates spanning decades, its conclusion quiet and complete. The closing chapter of the Emily Carter case did not announce itself with ceremony. It settled into the town the way winter always had, gradually and without spectacle. By the time the final appeal deadline passed, the community had already absorbed the outcome into its collective understanding. What remained was not a story of shock, but a record of endurance, patience, and procedure that had finally aligned with accountability. For investigators still active, the case reinforced a truth learned early and often tested. Time does not erase evidence if evidence is respected. The seals placed in 1995, the handwriting that resisted shortcuts, the choice to store rather than discard, all mattered. In internal briefings, supervisors emphasized that the case was not solved by a single innovation, but by the cumulative effect of restraint. That lesson carried forward into daily work, shaping how new cases were approached, logged, and preserved. Emily Carter's name no longer appeared on active bulletins or reminder boards, yet it remained present in training rooms and policy discussions. Officers spoke of her case when explaining why early assumptions can mislead, why community familiarity must never replace verification, and why local knowledge cuts both ways. The fact that the offender had been woven into the town's fabric underscored the necessity of neutrality, a principle easier stated than practiced. The judicial record, once finalized, reflected a process that unfolded as intended. Motions were answered, rulings explained, and findings entered with clarity. The sentencing order specified terms without commentary, adhering strictly to statute. There were no special conditions beyond those mandated. The restraint of the document mirrored the restraint of the investigation itself, an alignment that reinforced legitimacy. In the months that followed, inquiries from outside agencies arrived, requesting summaries and permission to review materials for instructional use. Each request was vetted, redactions applied where appropriate, and access granted in a manner consistent with policy. The case began to circulate quietly among professionals, cited not for notoriety but for method. Its value lay in what it demonstrated rather than what it dramatized. The town's relationship with the case evolved as well. Initial reactions of disbelief gave way to reflection. Conversations at diners and hardware stores shifted from speculation to acknowledgement of complexity. There was recognition that proximity does not confer insight, and that ordinary appearances can coexist with hidden wrongdoing. These discussions were subdued, informed by age and experience, shaped by an understanding that certainty comes from records, not impressions. Seasonal rituals continued unchanged. Thanksgiving brought familiar gatherings, conversations turning briefly to remembrance before returning to routine. Christmas lights illuminated storefronts that had witnessed the investigation's earliest days. New Year's passed quietly, marked by resolutions unrelated to the case. Life, consistent and unsentimental, resumed its cadence. For Emily's extended family, the years after closure involved recalibration. The absence that had defined holidays softened into a quieter presence, acknowledged without reopening wounds. Photographs were displayed again, not as reminders of loss, but as affirmations of a life that had existed beyond its ending. The bench near the gazebo remained a place of pause, not pilgrimage. Institutionally, the case influenced budgeting decisions. Data presented to county officials showed the tangible return of investment in evidence storage and periodic review. Funding lines were maintained, cold case positions preserved. The argument was simple and effective. Diligence, sustained over time, yields outcomes that restore confidence. The farm road where Emily had been found faded further into obscurity. Maintenance crews performed routine work without reference to its history. New residents passed it without knowledge of what had once occurred nearby. The land did not change, but its meaning did, receding into records rather than memory. Within the sheriff's office, a final notation was added to the case log marking administrative closure. The entry was brief, consistent with all others, and signed by the current supervisor. The act carried weight not because of its wording but because of what it concluded. A file opened in December 1995 had reached its end. Looking back, investigators acknowledged moments when the case might have slipped into permanent dormancy. Staffing shortages, shifting priorities, and evolving technology each posed risks. That it did not was attributed to culture rather than chance. A shared understanding had prevailed that unresolved cases remain obligations, regardless of age. As newer officers joined the department, they encountered the case not as a headline but as a lesson embedded in procedure. They learned to write reports with an eye toward future readers, to preserve items whose value was not yet apparent, and to respect the slow accrual of clarity. These practices, mundane in isolation, formed the foundation upon which resolution eventually stood. The broader public rarely revisited the case, and that was appropriate. Closure does not require constant retelling. It requires confidence that the system functioned as designed, correcting itself over time. In Orangeburg, that confidence took root quietly, supported by documentation rather than rhetoric. Years later, when winter mornings again brought frost to pine needles and cold air to courthouse corridors, the rhythms felt familiar. Radios crackled with routine calls. Clerks unlocked doors. Investigators reviewed new files. Somewhere in storage, Emily Carter's case rested among others, complete, its pages unchanged but its purpose fulfilled. The town moved forward, carrying with it the knowledge that persistence matters, that patience can coexist with urgency, and that justice, when grounded in method, arrives without noise. The story ended not with celebration, but with order restored and a record closed, the way such stories are meant to conclude.